I didn't always know I was holding things in. At first it felt natural, almost responsible, like something mature people did. You listen more than you speak. You adapt. You don't make everything about yourself. That's how it started. Small moments where I chose silence because it seemed easier. Because it kept the peace. Because it avoided explanations I didn't know how to give. I told myself it was temporary. That once things settled down, once I felt more confident, once the timing was right, I would speak. I would explain. I would let people see what was really going on inside me. But time passed, and silence became familiar. I learned how to be present without being visible, how to participate without revealing too much. I learned which thoughts were safe to share and which ones needed to stay hidden. No one taught me this directly. It was something I absorbed. From reactions, from subtle discomfort, from moments where honesty felt like it created distance instead of connection. So I adjusted. I became careful with my words. I filtered my emotions before they reached my mouth. I translated what I felt into something more acceptable, something lighter. Over time, that translation became automatic. People began to describe me in ways that sounded positive. Calm, easygoing, strong, reliable. I accepted those labels even when they didn't fully fit, especially when they didn't, because correcting them felt risky. It meant revealing parts of myself that didn't match the image, and I wasn't sure what would happen if that image cracked. Silence gave me control, or at least that's what I believed. It allowed me to observe without being questioned, to support others without asking for support back, to be needed without being exposed. But beneath that control, something else was happening. Unspoken thoughts didn't disappear. They accumulated. They settled in my body, in the form of tension I couldn't explain, in the way my jaw tightened during conversations, in the heaviness I felt after social interactions that looked normal on the surface. I began to feel disconnected from my own reactions, like I was watching myself respond instead of actually responding. There were moments when I wanted to say something simple, a disagreement, a boundary, a need. And I didn't. Not because I didn't know how, but because I didn't know what it would change. Silence became a habit, and habits feel safe even when they're harmful. I started to notice how often I rehearsed conversations that never happened. How many explanations lived only in my head. How many versions of myself existed internally, but never made it into the room. I wasn't lying to people, I was editing myself. And the edits became so frequent that I forgot where the original ended and the performance began. What made it more complicated was that nothing seemed obviously wrong. My life functioned. Relationships existed. Responsibilities were met. From the outside, everything looked balanced. But internally, there was a growing sense of absence. Like something essential was missing, and I couldn't quite name it. I thought maybe this was just adulthood, that everyone felt this way, that carrying unspoken things was part of being mature. But the weight kept increasing, and with it came a quiet fear. The fear that if I ever stopped filtering myself, there might not be anyone left who recognized me. That fear kept the confessions inside. And this is where the story really begins. Not with something dramatic, not with a betrayal or a loss, but with all the things I learned to never say. The day I almost spoke didn't announce itself. There was no warning, no dramatic sign, no feeling that something important was about to happen. It started like every other day I had lived while carrying silence inside me. I woke up, followed the same routine, answered messages with automatic politeness, fulfilled expectations that required my presence, but never my truth. Everything seemed normal on the surface, but internally, there was a strange tension I couldn't ignore. It felt like the words were closer than usual. Not loud, not urgent, just closer. The meeting itself was ordinary. A familiar environment, familiar faces. The kind of situation where nothing ever really changes. Conversations followed their usual path, predictable and safe. People spoke with confidence, repeating opinions they had shared many times before. I listened, like I always did. But this time, my attention wasn't fully on them. My mind kept drifting to the same place. The things I had never said. the thoughts I constantly edited before they reached my mouth, the version of myself I kept hidden to preserve balance. At some point, the conversation slowed. Someone looked at me and waited. It was my turn to speak. There was a pause, short enough that no one noticed, long enough that I felt everything at once. In that pause, I realized how prepared I was. I knew exactly what I wanted to say. The words were clear. They weren't aggressive, they weren't dramatic, they were honest. I wanted to talk about exhaustion, about how tired I was of always adapting, about how invisible it feels to be valued only for being calm, understanding, and agreeable. I wanted to explain that my silence wasn't peace, it was survival. For the first time, I wasn't confused. I wasn't emotionally lost, I was ready. And then fear arrived. Not the fear of rejection, not the fear of conflict. It was the fear of disappointment. The fear of breaking the image people had built of me. The fear of stepping out of the role that kept everything running smoothly. The fear of becoming inconvenient. I looked around the room. Everyone was comfortable, relaxed, unchallenged. My silence worked for them. It always had. Speaking would change the atmosphere. It would force reactions. It would introduce discomfort into a space that relied on stability. And no one had asked me to do that. I realized something painful in that moment. My honesty was optional, but my silence was expected, so I hesitated. The longer I stayed quiet, the heavier the words became. The truth doesn't like to wait. And when it does, it presses harder. I could feel my heart racing, not from anxiety, but from awareness. I was standing at the edge of something important, and I stepped back. I chose safety. I chose familiarity. I chose the version of myself that everyone recognized. I said something neutral, a carefully measured response. Nothing that revealed too much. Nothing that disturbed the flow. The conversation continued. Laughter returned. The rhythm restored itself. The moment closed. No one noticed what almost happened. To them, it was just another exchange, another normal interaction, another proof that I was still the same. But to me, it felt like loss. Not because I failed to speak, but because I proved to myself that I was still afraid of what honesty might cost. After that day, the silence felt different. It was no longer protective. It felt heavier, almost accusatory, as if it reminded me of the choice I had just made. I replayed that moment repeatedly, not imagining dramatic outcomes, but wondering how it would have felt to finally be real, to hear my own voice without filters. What stayed with me wasn't regret, it was frustration. I realized I wasn't quiet because I lacked courage. I was quiet because I didn't want to lose my place in conversations, my place in relationships, my place in the version of harmony I helped maintain. That realization unsettled me, because once you see that silence is a strategy, not a personality trait, you can't unsee it. The confessions remained unspoken, but now they were restless, and for the first time I understood that staying quiet wasn't neutral anymore, it was a decision. The weight of what stayed silent didn't fall on me all at once. It settled slowly, quietly, almost politely. At first I barely noticed it. I just felt more tired than usual, less present, less patient. Rest no longer felt like rest. Even in quiet moments, my mind stayed active, replaying conversations that had already ended, rewriting answers I never gave, imagining versions of myself that never showed up. The unspoken truths followed me everywhere. They appeared during ordinary moments when nothing was happening. Sitting alone, eating without appetite, lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, feeling surrounded by thoughts I refused to release. I started asking myself when this habit began. When did silence become my default response? There wasn't a single moment, no clear memory. It was repetition, small decisions made to avoid discomfort, tiny adjustments that slowly reshaped me. I didn't become quiet overnight. I became quiet through practice. The body noticed before the mind admitted it. I felt tension in my shoulders without knowing why. I reacted sharply to things that didn't deserve it. I withdrew emotionally from people who hadn't done anything wrong. The problem wasn't them, it was the accumulation. Relationships began to feel thinner, not broken, not damaged, just shallow. I was there, physically present, emotionally distant. Conversations happened, but they lacked depth. Connection existed, but it was built on routine instead of truth. I told myself this was normal, that everyone hides parts of themselves, that adulthood requires restraint, that speaking less was a sign of maturity. But deep down, I knew this wasn't balance. It was self-erasure disguised as calm. People talked about me with certainty. They described my personality, my limits, my values, as if they knew me completely. And I listened, aware that their version of me was built from fragments I allowed them to see. Correcting them would require effort. Explaining myself would require courage, and I didn't feel ready for either. So I stayed quiet. The weight increased. It began to affect my energy. I woke up tired, ended days exhausted without knowing what I had done. Motivation faded. Enthusiasm disappeared. Even things I once enjoyed felt distant. I started feeling disconnected from my own life, like I was watching myself from a distance, following a script written by someone else. The confessions that never left my mouth transformed into something else. Distance, emotional numbness, a controlled apathy that protected me from feeling too much. People noticed the change. They commented that I seemed different, more reserved, less engaged, less available. They weren't wrong. I was pulling away because staying meant continuing to perform. The weight also changed how I saw myself. I questioned whether I still knew who I was when no one was around, whether the quiet version of me was authentic, or simply a habit that had gone too far. There were moments when I considered accepting this as permanent, telling myself that this was just how life worked, that silence was the price of belonging. But something inside resisted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to make me uncomfortable. The weight of what stayed silent was no longer something I could ignore. It demanded attention. It demanded a response. And I understood something important. Silence doesn't stay neutral forever. Eventually, it becomes a burden. I hadn't spoken yet, but the cost of not speaking was becoming impossible to deny. The weight wasn't asking for permission anymore, it was asking for a choice. There comes a moment when silence stops being quiet. It doesn't announce itself, it doesn't explode, it simply changes texture. What once felt controlled starts to feel heavy. What once felt safe starts to feel suffocating. That was when I noticed it. Silence had become loud, not in sound but in presence. It followed me into conversations, standing between words that should have been said. It sat beside me during moments that required honesty. It filled the space where my voice should have been. People spoke. I nodded. I agreed. I smiled at the right moments. On the outside, everything looked fine. But inside, I felt like I was constantly holding my breath, every unsaid truth pressed against my chest. I began to feel irritated by small things, delays, questions, opinions. Not because they were wrong, but because they demanded engagement, and engagement risked exposure. Speaking meant explaining meant revealing, and revealing meant vulnerability, so I avoided it. But avoidance has a cost. The more I stayed silent, the more misunderstood I became. People filled the gaps with their own interpretations. They assumed my intentions. They defined my limits. They decided what mattered to me. And I let them. Correcting them felt exhausting. It felt like opening a door I had spent years reinforcing. I told myself it wasn't worth it, but each misunderstanding added weight. Moments that should have brought closeness instead created distance. I felt alone in rooms full of people. I listened to conversations about me that didn't include the truth. Sometimes I wanted to interrupt, to clarify, to say, "That's not who I am." But the words stayed trapped. Silence had trained me well. It taught me to swallow reactions, to soften opinions, to downplay emotions. Over time, I forgot what my unfiltered voice sounded like. The loudness of silence showed up at night, in the stillness, when distractions disappeared and there was nowhere to hide. Thoughts grew sharper. Memories replayed with precision. Every moment I chose quiet over honesty returned, demanding attention. I realized something uncomfortable. Silence wasn't protecting me anymore. It was isolating me. The walls I built to stay safe had also trapped me inside. I began to question my relationships. Not because they were bad, but because they were incomplete. They were built around a version of me that was easier to accept, easier to manage. But it wasn't the full truth, and the full truth wanted to breathe. I felt it in my body. Restlessness, tightness, a constant sense of being slightly out of place, even in familiar environments. I wasn't angry at others. I was frustrated with myself. Because I had chosen this, not once, but repeatedly. Silence had become a habit, and habits don't disappear just because we recognize them. They require confrontation. The loudness grew unbearable. It demanded a decision. Continue shrinking to maintain comfort, or risk discomfort to reclaim myself. I wasn't ready to speak yet. Not fully, but I was no longer willing to pretend that silence was neutral. It had a voice now, and it was asking me how long I planned to ignore it. There is a strange moment right before the truth comes out. It doesn't arrive suddenly, it approaches slowly, testing the space, measuring the risk. You feel it forming before it becomes words. That was where I stood, on the edge of saying something that had lived inside me for years. I remember the physical sensation clearly. My chest tightened, not with fear, but with pressure. Like something had been knocking from the inside, asking for permission to exist. I wasn't alone when it happened. Other people were there, talking about ordinary things. Their voices blended together, creating a familiar background noise. But my attention wasn't on them. It was on the sentence forming in my mind. A simple sentence, honest, unfiltered. I rehearsed it silently, adjusting it to sound less dramatic, less inconvenient. I tried to make it palatable, something that wouldn't disrupt the room. But every version felt like a lie. The real truth refused to be softened. My heart began to race. Not because I was afraid of rejection, but because I knew that once spoken, there would be no way back. The version of me that stayed quiet would disappear, and I wasn't sure who I would be without him. That silence I had lived with for so long suddenly felt fragile, like thin glass under pressure. One word could shatter it. Someone asked me a question, a direct one, innocent even. It was the opening. I felt my mouth open slightly. Air moved in. My body leaned forward almost instinctively. This was it. The moment I had imagined countless times. The moment where everything could change, not because the world shifted, but because I finally did. I wanted to say that I was tired, that I felt invisible, that I had carried expectations that were never mine. I wanted to admit that being strong had slowly erased parts of me, that being reliable had turned into being replaceable, that being quiet had made people forget I had needs. All of it was there, ready. And then doubt arrived, not loud, not aggressive, just a whisper. What if this changes how they see you? What if this makes things awkward? What if they don't understand? I hesitated. In that hesitation, I felt years of conditioning pulling me backward. Every time I chose harmony over honesty, every time I convinced myself that speaking up wasn't worth the trouble. My throat tightened, the words stalled. The room didn't notice. The conversation continued as if nothing had happened. Someone laughed, someone else responded. Life moved forward without waiting for my courage to catch up. I closed my mouth. The truth retreated, but it didn't disappear. It settled deeper, heavier than before. I felt a mix of relief and disappointment. Relief that I hadn't disrupted anything. Disappointment that I had once again disrupted myself. That was when I understood something painful. The hardest part wasn't speaking the truth. It was accepting the consequences of being seen. Because silence had protected me from judgment, but it had also protected others from knowing me. That almost moment changed me. Not because I spoke, but because I realized how close I was, how ready I had become, how impossible it was to go back to ignorance. Once you almost tell the truth, pretending you don't have one becomes exhausting. I knew then that silence was running out of time, and that the next opportunity wouldn't feel optional. Silence doesn't break all at once. It cracks, slowly, quietly, in places no one sees. For a long time, I believed something dramatic would be required. A confrontation, an argument, a moment so intense that staying quiet would be impossible. But that's not how it happened. What finally broke the silence was something small, a question. Someone looked at me and asked, without pressure or expectation, "Are you okay?" Not as a greeting, not out of politeness, but as a genuine pause. The question lingered in the air longer than it should have, and for the first time, I didn't rush to answer. I felt the familiar reflex rising, the automatic response, the smile, the dismissal. "I'm fine." The words were right there, but something inside me resisted, not loudly, not forcefully, just enough. I realized I was tired of being fine, tired of translating my exhaustion into acceptability, tired of shrinking my truth to fit other people's comfort, tired of carrying everything alone and calling it strength. I inhaled slowly. That breath felt heavier than any speech I had imagined. It carried years of restraint with it. When I spoke, my voice didn't sound the way I expected. It wasn't confident, it wasn't dramatic, it was honest. "I don't know how to answer that," I said. The room changed, not because anyone reacted strongly, but because I had finally stepped into the space I had avoided for so long. I didn't explain everything, I didn't list grievances, I didn't justify my feelings. I simply allowed myself to be uncertain. To not have a polished version of my emotions, that was enough. Once the silence cracked, it couldn't be repaired. The words started coming, not in a rush, but in fragments, small truths, controlled confessions, sentences that felt unfamiliar yet necessary. No one interrupted, no one tried to fix me. They just listened. And in that listening, I understood something profound. Silence had convinced me that my truth was a burden. But speaking revealed that it was a bridge. Not everyone crossed it. Not everyone understood. But some did. And that was more than I had allowed myself to hope for. After that moment, things didn't magically improve. Life didn't reorganize itself around my honesty. But something fundamental had shifted. I felt lighter. Not because problems disappeared, but because they were no longer hidden. I began to speak more. Not constantly, not recklessly, but intentionally. I learned that silence isn't always harmful. Sometimes it's necessary, sometimes it's protective. But when silence becomes fear, it stops being peace. It becomes a prison. Breaking it didn't make me louder, it made me clearer. Clear about my limits, clear about my needs, clear about who I am when I'm not trying to be easy to accept. The confessions that were never spoken still exist. Some truths remain private. Some stories are mine alone. But I no longer confuse silence with survival, because being heard isn't about volume, it's about presence. And for the first time in a long time, I was fully present.